In the mid-19th century, the nation of China was convulsed by one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, a war ignited by the visions of a failed scholar turned prophet. In fact, it was so deadly that conservative estimates state 20 to 30 million deaths, up to 10% of the population at the time. It started in 1851 when Hung-Siu-Tshuen, a former school teacher who believed himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, declared a new dynasty, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. What followed was not a spiritual movement, but an apocalyptic civil war that raged for 14 years. Cities were reduced to ashes, ancient traditions were upended, and entire provinces were laid to waste. Yet amidst all the chaos, the rebels fostered a radical dream of social equality, religious renewal, and a heavenly kingdom of great peace. It's a story as tragic as it is dramatic, a clash between an ecstatic vision of utopia and the harsh realities of the Qing dynasty. And so, from the humble beginnings of a charismatic Hakka peasant leader to the fiery collapse of his celestial empire in Nanjing, the rise and fall of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom is a tale of idealism and fanaticism, of heroism, and of course, horrific bloodshed. It's not often told, this tale of the Taiping Rebellion, but we should talk about it as one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. If you want to know all the details, well, you're in the right place. Allow me to welcome you to the channel. I am your host, and here we are once again. If you're returning, hello, and if you're new, good to meet you. I will remind our viewers that we are completely ad-free due to the generous support of the patrons, the members, those who donate, and those who look at the merch store. Thank you very much to those. We always begin with a thank you to them. But just thank you for joining us. If you want to support the channel, you're already doing the right thing by being here and just enjoying the content. And I do hope you enjoy. So let's get nice and relaxed, do the whole like, comment, subscribe thing, and we may begin. So let's start from the root cause, and that is the aforementioned Hung-Siu-Tshuen. We really need to understand him first, and in general the world that produced him, somewhat of a product of his circumstances. He was born in 1814 to a poor Hakka family in Guangdong province. Now, Hakka is one of the ethnic groups. They also called the Kejia in terms of their language. They were a migratory Han Chinese subgroup, and often they were viewed as outsiders by the local populations, bearing the share of grievances in a Qing empire strained by poverty, corruption, and of course, Western encroachment. From a young age, Hong was recognized as bright and ambitious. Now, do remember that Hong is the surname, and Xiucheng is the first name, if we're going to put it in those terms. His village pooled resources to educate him in the Confucian classics. You see, they'd hoped that one day he would pass the rigorous imperial service examinations, and therefore bring honor and prosperity to his clan. You see, back in those days in the Qing dynasty, if you wanted to get into the government, this was a system from earlier dynasties too, well, you didn't really get it by nepotism. You had to go in and take the test, and the test was extremely difficult. You couldn't just wing it, no multiple choice answers. You had to do all sorts of things, everything from civil service examinations to writing poetry just offhand. Really difficult. You had to be quite well-rounded, so no pressure on Hung-Siu-Tshuen. Well, he took the imperial examinations multiple times in the 1830s, and each time He failed. Given that less than 1% of candidates passed the actual exams, disappointment was not only common but quite expected. But Hong's successive failures were more and more devastating to him. In 1837, after his third failure, he suffered a severe mental and physical breakdown. He was bedridden and delirious for days, and at that time he experienced a series of intense visions or dreams that would change the course of his life, and ultimately kill 20 million to 30 million people. In Hung-Siu-Tshun's fevered vision, he found himself transported to a heavenly realm, and it was there, according to his later recollections, he encountered a venerable old man with a golden beard, and a younger man who appeared as an elder brother figure. In the dream, the old man lamented to Hong that the world was overrun by demons, and he bestowed upon him a divine sword, commanding him to slay them. The younger man in the vision aided and instructed Hong in this mission. Hong also saw figures he interpreted as demons. One account even says he saw Confucius being castigated for leading people astray. When Hong awoke from this hallucination, he was perplexed about its meaning. At the time, he didn't fully act upon the vision, passing it off as just a dream, and he recovered enough to resume teaching in school. But it wasn't until later, in 1843, after failing the exams a fourth and final time, that Hong discovered a key to understanding his dream. He found in his belongings a Christian pamphlet titled Good Words for Exhorting the Age. It had actually been given to him years earlier in Canton, which is modern-day Guangzhou. He'd only skimmed over it at the time. You know, when someone hands you a pamphlet, you just put it in your back pocket, or in your breast pocket of a jacket, and the next winter when you wear that jacket, you put your hand in the pocket and think, oh, I remember that. Kind of like one of those situations. Now, this booklet was written by a Chinese Christian convert called Liang A-fa. It outlined basic Protestant Christian doctrines and included excerpts from the Bible. Hong pored over it, and as he did, a revelation struck him, an epiphany. The figures in his vision now had names. He realized that the old man was the good heavenly Father, whom the pamphlet claimed as Shang-Di, the Chinese term for High God. And the elder brother, that was the older brother figure being Jesus Christ. In Hong's electrified imagination, the, quote, demons he was instructed to destroy were actually the idols and false teachings that were plaguing China, including the Qing dynasty itself, which he saw as a demonic regime of foreigners. Now, when he says foreigners, these days we don't view Manchus as foreigners, because China has its 56 ethnic groups, and Manchus are among them, among with Russians and Kazakhs and Turkic people, Uyghurs, all the rest. But at the time, the Manchus were seen as not Han Chinese. They came from Dongbei, which is way up in the north. We get this name Manchuria from that. So a lot of the Han Chinese saw them as outsiders, much like when the Mongols came in the Yuan dynasty. But most astonishingly, Hong concluded that he himself was the son of God's Chinese family. Literally, the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and he was chosen by God to rid the world of evil, starting with China. Armed with this new spiritual identity, Hung-Siu-Tshuen underwent a dramatic personal transformation. He began to destroy his household's idols and ancestral shrines as pagan objects, and he began preaching to family and friends, converting them to what he believed was the one true faith. Had to have a lot of confidence, that's for sure. In 1844, Hong and a close friend named Feng Yunshan set out to spread their message in the poorer rural areas of neighboring Kwang-si province, a region rife with banditry, economic distress, and sectarian strife. And do remember at the time that, yes, things were ran by the Qing dynasty, but there was plenty of warlords, especially in the south. The south kind of being a final frontier. In fact, in earlier times, they used to send people down to Guangdong as a kind of punishment. We're talking about Tang dynasty times, and Han dynasty, this kind of thing. Well, there, Feng stayed behind to reorganize a religious society among disaffected peasants, miners, and fellow Hakka people, while Hong returned home briefly. In 1847, Hong sought further understanding of Christianity by traveling to the British mission in Canton to study with an American Baptist missionary, Reverend Isaac R. J. Roberts. He spent about 2 months receiving instruction, but the relationship between the proud visionary and the strict missionary was uneasy. Apparently, Hong reportedly refused the standard baptism and questioned certain doctrines, his grasp of Christianity and the scriptures remaining highly unorthodox, which I can imagine that the preachers at the time would have said, "Hold on a minute, you came to us for instruction, and now you're trying to tell us what to do." Yeah, it must have been quite awkward. But nonetheless, Hong emerged from these encounters with added conviction and a few more scriptural references to bolster his own divine mission. By 1848, he rejoined Feng Yunshan in Guangxi, where Feng's God Worshippers Society, as they were called, had grown into quite a sizable congregation. This sect venerated one God, the Christian Jehovah, and preached equality under heaven. They sang hymns to the 10 Commandments, smashed traditional temple idols, and bonded under Hong's charismatic leadership. The late 1840s were a time of general desperation for many Chinese commoners, as much as, well, any other times were, but these were particularly desperate. You see, the Qing dynasty had recently been completely humiliated in the First Opium War. That was 1839 to 1842, where Britain forced open treaty ports. And of course, that's how they got Hong Kong. They ceded that in the first agreement, and a little bit more of it in the second agreement. In the countryside, floods, famines, and the exploitation of peasants by corrupt officials fueled even more anger. And then there were the ethnic tensions in Guangxi between Hakka settlers and local Cantonese natives. They're often called Yue people. Actually, the Cantonese language in Chinese is called Yueyu. I think in Cantonese it's called Yat-yu. Don't quote my Cantonese. I'm not as fluent in Cantonese as I am in Mandarin. Well, in any case, the stage was set for a major upheaval, and Hong's movement was a powder keg for a religious fervor and social resentment. In layman's terms, it was about to hit the fan. By 1850, the God worshippers had tens of thousands of followers. They lived communally, sharing property and emphasizing purity of faith. Now, the Qing local authorities, alarmed at this heterodox sect and its open rejection of Confucian practices, attempted to suppress them, which only pushed the group further toward open rebellion. And here's the other thing. I did mention that things are very far away from Beijing, the seat of power. So down in the south, you could get away with a little bit more. That's why nationalist movements fermented quite a bit more in the south during those times, during the later collapse of the Qing and all the rest. But in any case, if this had have happened in somewhere like, I don't know, Shandong, or even somewhere closer to Dongbei or Beijing, Hubei, something like that, things would have been suppressed quite a bit earlier, and the whole disaster would have most likely been averted. But since it was so far south, it was kind of under the radar for a while. In any case, January 1851, sensing the moment was ripe for action, Hung-Siu-Tshuen finally proclaimed an uprising against the Qing. And this was no mere local revolt. On the 11th of January 1851, Hong declared a formal formation of the Taiping Tien-Kwoh, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, with him himself as the Tianwang, the Heavenly King. Now this was a direct challenge to the reigning Qing Emperor Xianfeng. Hong was in effect declaring a new dynasty in China ordained by heaven, and fronted by himself, of course. And just like that, the Taiping Rebellion had well and truly begun. Now the Qing were a little bit overconfident. You see, at first the officials may have underestimated Hung-Siu-Tshun's rebellion as just another peasant insurrection in the hinterlands. And you can't really blame them, because it was among a series of dissatisfied peasants, thinking, well, the only choice we have is to bring out the pitchforks and demand a better life. Usually a show of force would sort them out. But it was going to be different this time. They soon realized that this was something far more formidable. In the initial phase, Hong's forces, calling themselves the Taipings, meaning Great Peace, fought a guerrilla war in the hills of Kwang-si. Armed with a zealous belief in divine protection, the Taiping soldiers, men and women by the way, proved to be surprisingly disciplined and effective. Many had little more than farm tools or muskets, but their morale was very high. They sang hymns, observed strict codes, no opium, no alcohol, no looting of fellow peasants, this kind of thing. They probably didn't smoke tobacco either, I assume. Well, they also believed themselves guided by heavenly commands. Hung-Siu-Tshuen, for his part, acted as both a spiritual leader and a strategist, though he relied heavily on able lieutenants like Feng Yunshan, Yang Xiucheng, and others who had military talent, some former Qing generals as well. From late 1850 to 1851, Qing troops engaged the Taipings in a series of battles in southwest China. Hong's forces won several early victories against these local Green Standard and Imperial troops, and it only fueled their confidence. As they defeated Qing units, they also gained weapons and recruits. Entire villages and clans, especially Hakkas and other oppressed groups, joined the cause as the Taipings marched on. In September of 1851, Hung-Siu-Tshun's nascent army scored a significant victory by seizing the city of Yong'an in Guangxi. There, Hong formally organized a government for his heavenly kingdom. He appointed his closest followers to kingly ranks, with color titles corresponding to directions. Yang Xiucheng was named the East King, Xiao the West King, Feng Yunshan the South King, and Wei Changhui as the North King, and Shi Da-kai as the Wing King, signifying a kind of assistant king, kind of like a vanguard role. Well, these kings were both military commanders and high ministers in the Taiping hierarchy. Hong, as the heavenly king right in the center, stood above them all, and was the ultimate authority, believed to be communicating God's will, a direct line to the heavens. While Hong was venerated almost as a living deity by his followers, interestingly he also taught that all believers were children of God. There was a millenarian, egalitarian streak in Taiping Christianity. The movement portrayed itself not just as a rebellion, but as a holy crusade. They were going to cleanse China of the demon Qing and all corrupt elements, and after that they were taking on the world. By 1852, Qing imperial forces mounted larger offensives to crush the Taipings, but the rebels were elusive and ferocious. Under pressure in Guangxi, the Taiping army decided to go on a monumental trek, a kind of proto-long march. They broke out of encirclement and marched northward and eastward across several provinces. essentially a strategic exodus toward the Yangtze River heartland. This odyssey took them through Hunan, where they fought through cities that were bastions of conservative Confucian gentry, many of whom, by the way, were horrified by the Taiping's iconoclasm and egalitarian rhetoric. Well, in each region, the Taiping forces tried to win over the population, sometimes by distributing captured food and silver, sometimes by force, and by proclaiming their vision of an era of peace and justice under heaven, a lot of the time winning people over by saying, "Come on, anything's better than being ruled by the Manchus, right?" There were accounts of strict discipline, too. One often cited policy was that Taiping soldiers were forbidden from pillaging or harming civilians, especially fellow Han Chinese. If they were caught doing that, well, they would get the death penalty. But as for the Manchu bannermen and their families, they showed no mercy. They regarded them as demons, legitimate threats. You cannot allow them to live. In early 1853, the Taipings advanced along the Yangtze River, China's central artery. Their growing army, swelled by tens of thousands of new recruits from each region, they moved with astonishing speed. In February of 1853, they captured the city of Wuchang, which is the modern-day Wuhan, by the way, a major city on the mid-Yangtze. They are called the Yangtze in Chinese. Just a little bit of a note on pronunciation, too. Some of the older pronunciation of Chinese, like Yangtze, when it's spelled the T-Z-E way, that is a pronunciation called Wade Giles. It's a little bit old. These days, everybody uses pinyin, at least those enlightened Chinese learners. I don't know anybody who's using Wade Giles pronunciation anymore, but everyone learns pinyin now. Anyway, the fall of Wuchang sent shockwaves through the Qing court. The rebel army was demonstrating that it could take key urban centers, not just peasant villages. Things were getting pretty serious. But the most dramatic victory was yet to come. Marching downstream in March of 1853, Hung-Siu-Tshun's forces laid siege to Nanjing, the venerable former capital of the Ming dynasty located on the lower Yangtze. Now, Nanjing actually means southern capital. Beijing means northern capital. And interestingly, Tokyo actually means eastern capital. Now, of course, we say Tokyo in Japanese, but in Chinese it's actually Dongjing, which means east capital. So there you go. Well, after fierce fighting, the Taipings breached Nanjing's walls on the 10th of March, 1853. What followed was a grim testament to the war's ruthless nature. The Taiping soldiers, fueled by years of persecution and Hong's commands to annihilate demons, massacred the Manchu population of Nanjing. Men, women, and even children of Manchu ethnicity were killed en masse. Some estimates suggest tens of thousands were slain in Nanjing's Manchu quarter. Well, this was partly in revenge. Manchu bannermen had earlier shown no mercy to captured Taipings, and partly an effort to cleanse the demonic elements from the Heavenly Kingdom's new capital. Amid the slaughter, however, the Taiping leaders proclaimed that a new era had dawned. They renamed Nanjing to Tianjing, the heavenly capital. Hung-Siu-Tshuen, enthroned in the former Ming imperial palace, now the Ming was the dynasty that came before the Qing, reportedly wept tears of joy upon entering the city, believing that finally God's will was being done. The capture of Nanjing was the high point of Taiping's success and the formal establishment of their regime. In 1853, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom controlled a vast swath of China's richest regions. Much of Guangdong, Guangxi, Hunan, Hebei, Jiangxi, Anhui, and Jiangsu provinces had either come under Taiping administration or been disrupted by their armies. Hung-Siu-Tshun's vision had materialized into a state with millions of subjects. Nanjing. He set up a court and bureaucracy to govern in the name of God. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom now posed an existential threat to the Qing dynasty. Sensing this, Hong and his top lieutenants hoped to press their advantage further. In mid-1853, they launched the Northern Expedition, an ambitious military campaign to capture Beijing itself and topple the Qing Emperor. A Taiping army of perhaps 20,000 or more crack troops marched north from the Yangtze, pushing through central China and toward the heartland of the Qing. At the same time, another force was sent west from Sichuan, towards Sichuan rather. The Taiping leadership believed that if the Manchu regime, reeling from the shock of Nanjing's loss, were panicking, they could be brought down if hit from multiple fronts. And indeed they probably were panicking quite a bit at this point. But the Northern Expedition stretched Taiping forces too thin, and ultimately it failed. Taiping vanguards advanced as far as the outskirts of Tianjin, that is the port city near Beijing, coming within a few days' march of the capital by late 1853. But Qing defenders, aided by difficult winter conditions and the sheer exhaustion of the Taiping troops, managed to halt them. The expeditionary force, unable to take Beijing, was eventually encircled and nearly annihilated on its retreat south. Well, you can imagine that this defeat was a significant setback, bit of a morale blow, that's for sure. It showed that the Taipings, for all their fervor, could not easily overthrow the Qing in one blow. Meanwhile, back in the south, Qing forces regrouped and even retook some areas that the Taipings had swept through. And here was where the war settled into a new phase, one that would test whether the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom could sustain and govern the territory it seized. It's one thing to capture territory, another to keep it. And it seemed like that high point in Nanjing, the top of the mountain, well, there's only one way down, right? And so with Nanjing, or Tianjing as they called it, their capital, the Taiping leaders turned to the task of governing and implementing their vision of a heavenly kingdom. So let's just get away from the war aspect for the moment and just talk about what was actually going on behind the scenes, because that's important too. Well, Hung-Siu-Tshun's regime was a pretty curious blend of theocratic zeal, even a communist-like social policy, and military autocracy. In theory, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom aimed to remake society according to Hong's understanding of Christian principles and ancient Chinese egalitarian ideals. In the early stages, they announced radical policies that set them apart from the Qing order. One of the most famous was the land system of the Heavenly Kingdom. All land was to be owned by the state, i.e., held in common by the people, and periodically distributed equally to households, men and women, in units of a given size. Well, this policy, inspired by a mix of the Bible and perhaps lingering Confucian utopian ideas, was meant to ensure that no one would starve, and that class distinctions based on wealth would simply vanish. Once again, proto-communistic teachings. In practice, the land equalization was more of an ideal than a reality, especially amidst the war. But it showed the Taiping's revolutionary social ethos. In any case, it's an interesting idea for the time. But here's another policy: the promotion of social gender equality. The Taipings proclaimed that men and women were equal before God. Women were organized into separate military formations, and some women served as officers and administrators. Foot binding, the cruel custom of binding young girls' feet, was outlawed in Taiping territories, and that's a good thing. Suppose you've got to give credit where it's due. I did a full video on Chinese foot binding. It's, well, it's quite concerning. Very glad they left that one in the past. Some traditions are better off left behind. Oh, but I should say, though, the Manchu weren't doing foot binding. It was just the Han people doing foot binding, and a few of the other locals. In any case, I think that the Hakka as well were not participating in that. They had women out working in the fields like everybody else. In any case, these measures, which were astonishing for their time, attracted many women to the cause, and, of course, on the other side, horrified the conservative Confucian society. But all in all, religious faith was the cornerstone of daily life in the heavenly kingdom. Hung-Siu-Tshuen and his followers propagated a simplified form of Christianity, shorn of the formal theology, but steeped in the Old Testament ethos of an absolute, wrathful God. The Taipings observed a Sabbath on every seventh day, destroyed idols and ancestral temples, and built churches, perhaps repurposed temples for worship of Shang-Di, the Heavenly Father. They even composed their own hymns and written prayers. Every Taiping soldier was taught to recite the 10 Commandments, which Hung had slightly revised. You see, he had added injunctions against demon-worshipping and expanding the definition of adultery to include polygamy and foot-binding. Blasphemy and idol worship were harshly punished. The traditional Confucian civil examinations were abolished and replaced with tests on biblical knowledge and Taiping religious songs. Not very practical, but sure more about loyalty. In essence, you can say that the Taiping state positioned itself as a purified kingdom under God's law, casting the Confucian Qing state and its culture as demonic falsehoods to be eradicated. But in terms of governance, Hung-Siu-Tshuen assumed supreme authority as the heavenly king. Remember, he being at the center of the other cardinal direction kings. But he delegated considerable power to his top lieutenants, especially the other kings. Now, the most formidable of these was Xiucheng, the East King, who had effectively become the chief administrator of Tianjing. Xiucheng had been a firewood seller who joined the movement early and was known for his charismatic trances. In Nanjing, Xiucheng took charge of organizing the civil administration and military strategy. He proved to be an able, if authoritarian, leader, rebuilding the city's defenses, managing supply lines, and directing field generals in ongoing campaigns. However, Yang's ambition and methods soon introduced new tensions at the Taiping court. He claimed to channel the voice of God during fits of religious ecstasy, during which he would issue directives ostensibly from the Heavenly Father. And at times, these divine pronouncements included reprimands, even for Hung-Siu-Tshuen. You can see how this is becoming a bit of a problem, right? You can't have two central kings, can't you? There was one infamous episode where Xiucheng, while speaking as if possessed by the Holy Spirit, demanded that Hong kneel and repent for an instance where Hong had mistreated his own concubine, of which he had quite a few, by the way. It's quite convenient how all of these cult leaders end up having quite a lot of concubines. Isn't that funny? Well, the notion that the heavenly king himself should be scolded by his subordinate, even if it was under the claim of God's voice, certainly did not sit well with Hung-Siu-Tshuen. Although Hong initially acquiesced, publicly bowing to the will of God, as spoken by Yang, resentment festered. Meanwhile, the daily life for ordinary people under Taiping rule was a mix of stern morality and the upheaval of war. The Taipings instituted segregated camps for men and women. Even married couples were often made to live apart, especially in the early years, to maintain chastity and focus on the holy war. This strict separation was deeply unusual in Chinese society. It was born from both a puritanical interpretation of Christianity and practical concerns of discipline, but still it was not popular. It did have some success in curbing abuse. Taiping camps were said to be notably orderly, lacking the rampant prostitution that often accompanied armies or the other unpleasant assault aspects that go on when sacking a city. But it also caused confusion and misery for some families. But still, many peasants under Taiping control initially welcomed relief from onerous Qing taxes and the promises of a more just rule. Like we said before, the Qing being so unpopular, people were willing to take a chance on something new, regardless of what it was. Local militias and bandits were crushed by Taiping armies, which sometimes brought a rough kind of peace to war-torn areas. The Taiping authorities tried to establish a functional bureaucracy, appointing officials in the cities and the councils where they held, often with titles like ministers or envoys of the heavenly king. They even printed their own currency and issued proclamations to communicate their laws and theology. A notable figure who joined the Taiping administration in these years was Rengan, a cousin of Hung-Siu-Tshuen. Rengan had spent time in British Hong Kong and was a Christian convert with a bit of knowledge about the wider world. When he arrived in Nanjing in 1859, he was given the title Shield King and became a sort of prime minister and chief advisor to Hung-Siu-Tshuen. Rengan proposed modernization reforms for the Heavenly Kingdom, including establishing hospitals, newspapers, modern banks, and even forming alliances with foreign powers. He even drafted a vision for transforming China into a modern country with railways and steamships. These ideas showed that not all Taiping leaders were purely focused on religious dogma. Some had proto-modernization impulses. But the problem was the practical implementation of such reforms was extremely limited by the ongoing war and internal politics. But within the heavenly capital, Tianjing, life at the court increasingly took on imperial trappings, albeit with a religious twist. Hung-Siu-Tshuen was treated with reverence and even awe by his followers. He wore imperial robes and lived in the former governor's palace, now rechristened as the Heavenly King's Palace, slapping that label on everything. Well, there was a ritual protocol for approaching him too. Subjects had to bow multiple times, though notably they bowed to him as a divine king rather than performing the full koto reserved for the Qing emperor. Some sources note that Hong forbade the traditional bowing method with your head touched to the ground because worship was to God alone. Hong appointed members of his own family to positions of privilege, which is no surprise. For instance, his two elder brothers were given titles, though they were said to be pretty mediocre figures. They didn't really do much. Hong himself, as time went on, seemed to retreat further into a life of contemplation and religious writing. He worked on theological justifications for his regime, producing documents that blended biblical references with his own interpretations. Some later commentators, including his own generals, observed that Hung-Siu-Tshuen became increasingly aloof from day-to-day governance, preferring to dwell on spiritual matters and to enjoy the luxuries of the palace. Indeed, one of the criticisms leveled against Hong is that by those who eventually wrote about him, including his fallen general Li Xiucheng, was that Hong indulged a large harem like a traditional monarch. Despite formally preaching monogamy and chastity to his followers, Hong had numerous concubines. Reports range from 36 to even hundreds of women in the palace. A little bit hypocritical. It did not endear him to some of his more principled followers, but a few dared speak against him as the Heavenly King. A little bit too risky. Well, through 1854, to 1855, the Taiping armies tried to consolidate and expand their territory from the Yangtze base. They engaged in numerous battles with Qing forces across central China. One major development was the rise of regional militia armies on the Qing side, which would gradually turn the tide against the Taiping. Traditional Qing bannerman troops had proven ineffective against the rebels, often suffering defeats due to poor morale and leadership. In response, a new model of resistance emerged. Educated gentry officials, most famously Zheng Guofan, who were granted imperial sanction to raise their own local armies, the Yongying, or the Brave Battalions. Zheng Guofan, a Confucian scholar from Hunan, took up the challenge to crush the Taipings out of a sense of duty and alarm at their iconoclasm. He formed the Xiang Army, named after the Xiang River in Hunan, consisting of Hunanese farmers and miners drilled into a disciplined force. But crucially, he funded and organized them through local bands of loyalty, rather than centralized Qing command. So it wasn't like they were fighting under a Qing commander. They had local commanders who would speak their local language in their local accent. It felt a little bit more reasonable to command them that way. Well, this approach led to more motivated troops on the Qing side as the war went on. But that didn't mean that in the mid-1850s the Taipings didn't have the upper hand, because they did. But that was all about to change. You see, the problem was, just as the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom reached the zenith of its territorial extent, it was quite nearly shattered from within by a deadly power struggle. Now, remember that rivalry between Hung-Siu-Tshuen and his most powerful general, Xiucheng? Well, it reached a breaking point in 1856. Yang's frequent claims of speaking with the voice of God had given him tremendous influence, perhaps more than Hung-Siu-Tshuen himself in practical affairs, especially since everyone was raising his eyebrows at that little harem situation he was keeping. Certainly doesn't add to his credibility as a spiritual leader, doesn't it? Hong grew increasingly weary that young Xiucheng might usurp leadership of the movement that Hong had founded. And with good reason, I suppose. There were probably many that preferred that he had taken over. Upper Taiping leaders, including the North King and the Wing King, Wei Changhui and Shi Da-kai, respectively, also chafed under Yang's domineering behavior. Yang was accused of arrogance and suspected of plotting to take the title of Heavenly King for himself, which is, of course, against the rules. And so in August of 1856, tensions exploded in what is known as the Tianjing Incident. Acting on secret orders from Hung-Siu-Tshuen, Wei Changhui and several other loyalists invited Yang Xiucheng to a banquet under false pretenses. And when he got there, they ambushed him. Yang Xiucheng and his family, as well as thousands of his adherents in Nanjing, were slaughtered in a sudden purge. The East King, once the architect of the Taiping administration, was dead, eliminated by the very regime he had helped build. In the wake of Yang's assassination, Wei Changhui, the North King, and his forces became overzealous, killing anyone suspected of having the slightest amount of loyalty to Yang. Blood filled the streets of the heavenly capital, and scores of Taiping officials were murdered in factional revenge. Hung-Siu-Tshuen, who had sanctioned Yang's removal, soon found that Wei Changhui had become a danger as well. Wei grew conceited and even threatened Hong's own brothers. Just weeks after Yang's fall, Hong ordered Wei Changhui executed to prevent him from accumulating too much power. This second violent purge further destabilized the Taiping leadership. Suddenly, 2 of the original 5 kings were gone. Yang and Wei were dead, and the West King, Xiao had died earlier in a battle. Only Shi Da-kai, the Wing King, remained at the top cohort besides Hong himself. And well, being the wing king, he was kind of like the bass player in a band, He wasn't that important. You could easily replace him. Sorry to all the bass players out there. Well, Xiucheng was a respected military commander, we will say that, and he was renowned for his bravery and beloved by the troops. But after the chaos of 1856, many expected Xiucheng to take on a greater role in directing the Taiping war effort. However, fearing for his own life and witnessing the fate of Yang and Wei, Xiucheng chose rather wisely to leave Tianjing. In early 1857, Xiucheng departed the capital with his loyal army, tens of thousands strong, and roamed southwest China as an independent rebel force, separate from Hong's direct control. Now you can imagine that this departure was certainly a blow to the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. It deprived Hong of one of his best generals, and more importantly, it signaled deep fractures at the top. If you don't think the Qing weren't looking on, rubbing their hands together, thinking, good, argue more. Well, yeah, of course they were, of course. In any case, after 1856, Hung-Siu-Tshuen grew ever more distrustful of any remaining talented leaders. And this was at a time when they needed the unity to face all of the Qing counterattacks. He increasingly surrounded himself with close kin and yes-men. He elevated his oldest brother, Hong Renfa, and second brother, Hong Renda, to high positions, even though they were, by all accounts, inept. They had no idea what they were doing. But here is the fate of tyrants, is that loyalty is always more important than competence. They hire people on those ideological grounds. The fate of all tyrants. That's it. Well, vital decisions and coordination suffered as a result. Hung-Siu-Tshuen receded from active command, focusing on religious teachings and, more importantly, the comforts of his palace. While the day-to-day burden of military operations fell to regional commanders like Xiucheng and Chen-Yu-Cheng, who rose to prominence later. This would prove problematic, mainly because without a strong central coordination, the Taiping forces in various provinces acted independently, missing opportunities to support each other against the tightening Qing offensive. And for the Qing, the Taiping self-destruction was a godsend. By the late 1850s, Qing generals like Zheng were making headway in retaking the Yangtze Valley. Zheng's Shang army had besieged and captured important cities such as Nanjing in late 1861 that were crucial to cutting off Nanjing's supply lines. Another emerging Qing general, Zuo Zongtang, was leading the fight in Xiucheng province, and Li Hongzhang, a protege of Zheng, raised the Huai army to protect the Shanghai region. The Taipings, though still capable of mounting offenses, were clearly on the defensive after 1856. There was an important factor that influenced the final years of the Taiping Rebellion, and that is the stance of the third party. You had the Taiping, the Qing, and then you had the Western powers, who were, well, meddling in China at the time, to say the least. Initially, foreign reactions to the Taipings was mixed. You see, Western missionaries were quite intrigued by this massive movement proclaiming Christianity. Kind of. A few, like Reverend Theodore Hamberg and later Joseph Edkins, visited the Taiping territory and even met some leaders. Hong Rengan's presence in Nanjing after 1859 was notable. He reached out to Western diplomats and Christian missionaries trying to gain support, or at least neutrality. The Taipings promised foreign merchants favorable trade and offered missionaries the prospect of China converted to Christianity. However, serious doubts arose among Westerners about the heterodox nature of Taiping beliefs and the disorder that the rebellion was causing. The Taipings had destroyed traditional temples, and sometimes also churches, that did not align with their own doctrine. And their claim that Hong was a new messiah figure was heretical to mainstream Christianity. Moreover, Western governments had just fought the Second Opium War against the Qing, ending in 1860 with the sacking of Beijing and new unequal treaties. They don't call it the century of humiliation for nothing. Once those new treaties gave Britain, France, and other powers greater privileges in China, the Europeans became more interested in a stable Qing government that would honor those treaties, rather than a radical fundamentalist regime that might not. Tensions between Taiping and foreigners came to a head around Shanghai. In 1860, taking advantage of the Qing's distraction with the war against Britain and France, the Taiping armies launched a major eastern campaign. King Xiucheng, who was called the Loyal King, one of the ablest Taiping generals, moved through Zhejiang and Jiangsu provinces, capturing the cities of Hangzhou and Suzhou, both prosperous centers. In the summer of 1860, Xiucheng's forces reached the outskirts of Shanghai, which was by then an international treaty port, and, by the way, protected by foreign navies. Now, the prospect of Taiping's capturing Shanghai alarmed the foreign community as much as it alarmed the Qing, because at the time Shanghai was as much of a foreign community's city as it was in the power of the Qing, in terms of trade at least, very valuable. Though the Taipings insisted they were only interested in the Qing, not foreigners, a joint British and French force decided to aid the Qing in defending Shanghai, and I'm sure that they were doing most of the heavy lifting. In any case, with superior modern weaponry and warships, the Westerners repelled the Taiping approach to Shanghai in August of 1860. From that point on, it became increasingly clear that the Western powers would not allow the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom to upset the new order they had imposed on the Qing. In 1861, the imperial court, now under the regency of Empress Dowager Cixi, since the Shenfeng emperor had died, authorized provincial officials to openly recruit Western mercenaries and acquire modern arms to fight the rebels. Obviously going to be a game changer. And a new kind of Qing allied force emerged, the ever-victorious army, a Chinese regional force led by foreign officers. The first such figure was Frederick Townsend Ward, an adventurous American who built a small but effective corps of mercenaries and Chinese soldiers drilled in Western tactics. Ward's ever-victorious army, supported by the governor of Shanghai, took the fight straight to the Taiping and the lower Yangtze region. They secured a number of towns back from the rebel control in 1862. But Ward eventually was killed in battle, and after that, the command of his mercenary force passed to a British officer, Charles George Gordon, who had a nickname, Chinese. Okay then. Well, under Gordon's leadership in 1863, the ever-victorious army, though numbering only a few thousand, became a highly mobile strike force armed with modern rifles and artillery. They coordinated closely with Li Hongjiang's Huai army. This collaboration had devastating results for the Taiping. Key cities like Suzhou were recaptured by the Qing with foreign help. The ball was well and truly rolling now. In one notable incident in late 1863, Gordon negotiated the surrender of Suzhou from a group of Taiping commanders by offering them clemency, only to have his Qing counterparts execute those surrendered rebels anyway. Now this treachery disgusted Gordon and caused a temporary diplomatic problem. But in any case, the deed was done. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, as they say, and the Taiping military leadership was further decimated. But good luck making any peace treaties now. But on the broader front, the Qing armies under Zheng Guofan and Zuo Zongtang were steadily advancing. Zheng Fan's capture of Nanjing in 1861 was particularly significant. Nanjing, located upriver from Nanjing, had been a vital Taiping stronghold, protecting Nanjing's western flank. Its fall meant that Nanjing was increasingly isolated and could not easily receive food from inland provinces. Xiucheng recovered Hangzhou in 1864, pushing the Taipings completely out of eastern Zhejiang. In the southwest, the roaming forces of Shi Kai, the ex-Taiping Wing King, met a tragic end. They were cornered by Qing troops in Sichuan, and Shi Kai surrendered in 1863 in exchange for sparing his followers. He was executed by slow death, Ling Chi, that is the 1,000 cuts. Not a good way to go. Many of his men, sadly, were slaughtered despite the sacrifice. So once again, broken agreements. Despite the setbacks, the Taipings did not collapse overnight. They fought tenaciously in defense of their kingdom. Xiucheng, in particular, emerged as the last great champion of the Taiping cause. He orchestrated the defense of Nanjing and repeatedly tried to break the Qing siege lines in the early 1860s. Another young Taiping general, Chen, known as the Heroic King, led daring operations to relieve besieged cities and gather provisions. But Chen was captured by the Qing in 1862, and he was executed, once again depriving the Taipings of another brilliant commander. By 1863, the noose was tightening around Nanjing. Nanjing had fallen, Suzhou had fallen, and most of the rebel-held territory was shrinking day by day. Yet Hung-Siu-Tshuen and his inner circle were not willing to give up just yet. They trusted in divine deliverance, even as the material situation grew dire, firmly convinced that God was on their side. And so, by early 1864, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was reduced essentially to its capital and a few pockets of resistance. Nanjing was by then surrounded by Qing forces under the overall command of Zheng, that is Zheng Fan's brother, by the way, who led the siege. And Zheng Fan was there too. He coordinated from Nanjing. Now, inside Nanjing, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The populace, swelled by refugees, faced starvation as supply lines were cut. Hung-Siu-Tshuen, who had always preached faith in divine providence, took an even more otherworldly approach to the crisis. Apparently, he told his followers that God would provide for them. According to accounts by those present, including General Xiucheng's later testimony, when pleaded to provide food or get something for the starving city, Hong issued a bizarre directive that the people should gather and eat sweet dew. And by that he meant the wild herbs and vegetables growing around them. Hong even demonstrated this by gathering weeds from his palace gardens, cooking them into a ball or porridge, and consuming them for his sustenance. Now this was meant to be a pious example, trusting in God's natural provision. But rather ironically, it might have been the final mistake of his life, because you see, in May of 1864, Hung-Siu-Tshuen fell gravely ill. Food poisoning, it seems, likely weakened as well by prolonged malnutrition or possibly ingesting inedible herbs. As Qing mines and artillery shells rocked Nanjing's walls daily, the Heavenly King was dying. June 1st, 1864, Hung-Siu-Tshuen died within his palace. Taiping sources later claimed he ascended to heaven. Others say he took his own life by taking poison, despairing at the looming end. He was 50 years old at the time. To avoid chaos, the Taiping court hastily proclaimed Hong's young son, Hung Tien-Kwoh, also called Hung Fu-Tian, a teenage boy, as the new heavenly king. But this boy had no influence to change the course of events. Teng-Kwoh's forces continued to pound Nanjing. On July 19, 1864, after breaching the outer walls with explosives, the Qing army stormed on in. And what ensued was a scene of apocalyptic violence. After years of frustration and heavy losses, the Qing soldiers took merciless revenge. They slaughtered not only the surviving Taiping fighters, but also tens of thousands of civilians, men, women, and children alike. No one was spared. Contemporary accounts from the Qing side even mention soldiers amusing themselves by hacking apart infants. So horrific was the slaughter that Teng-Kwoh, the commanding general, wrote in disgust that children not even 2 years old were cut down for sport by his own men. He had tried to restrain them, but once the city was given over to plunder, the pent-up fury and greed was uncontrollable. Nanjing burned, and the glorious heavenly capital was turned into a slaughterhouse. In the final moments of Nanjing's fall, Taiping loyalists attempted to escape or fight to the death. Xiucheng, the loyal king, gathered a remnant of troops and managed to break out from the city just before it was completely overrun. He was devoted to Hong's memory, despite having criticized Hong's decisions, and tried to save the young heavenly prince by fleeing with him. Li gave his own horse to Hong's teenage son to improve the boy's chances of escape. However, they were separated in the chaos, and within days, Xiucheng was captured by Qing pursuers in the countryside. Brought before Teng-Kwoh and then Teng-Kwoh, Xiucheng was interrogated at length. He composed a written confession, a narrative of the Taiping campaigns, a remarkable document in which he recounted the history and failings of the rebellion from his own perspective. Despite promises of leniency, once his utility was exhausted, Teng-Kwoh had Xiucheng executed in August of 1864. Hung-Siu-Tshun's son, the would-be teenage king, was also soon captured and executed. The last ember of the Taiping royal line extinguished. Other Taiping princes and generals met similar fates, or took their own lives when cornered. And with that, the Great Rebellion was finally over. Scattered bands of Taiping fighters continued to resist for a little while in the provinces. After all, this had been a mass movement with deep roots, and it took until 1865 to 66 for Qing forces to extinguish most of these pockets of resistance. Some groups in the border regions or remote hills even held out a bit longer, unwilling to surrender and facing extermination. By the end of 1864, the grand vision of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was gone forever. Oh, but as for Hung-Siu-Tshuen, July 30th, 1864, the Qing forces had finally found where he was buried, so they dug him up, cut his head off, and then they cremated his body. Now, he didn't want to be cremated, so this was a little bit rude, but I think they were past the point of good manners. Now, Teng-Kwoh, who was, remember, one of the prominent generals, had ordered this done so they could really make sure that Hung-Siu-Tshuen was actually dead. They didn't want any rumors spreading around or anything else. And in a final unceremonious act, believe it or not, for eternal punishment for daring to go against the Qing, Hung-Siu-Tshun's ashes were stuffed into a cannon and shot out into the air. Not quite the memory he wanted, but it was the only one he was going to get. That's not quite where it ends, though. In the immediate aftermath, the Qing government prodded by its leaders like Teng-Kwoh, Li Hongzhang, and Zuo Zongtang, began what is known as the self-strengthening movement. They'd learned the hardest way possible that things needed to change. These scholar generals took leading roles in rebuilding the nation, infrastructure, agriculture, and crucially, adopting some Western technology and military techniques to prevent future Taipings or foreign invaders from invading China. Ironically, the success against the Taipings had depended on decentralized powers, the regional armies, and this trend of strong regional armies and leaders persisted, sowing seeds for warlordism in the coming decades, which would become a big problem of its own all the way up to the Republic of China times. Nonetheless, the Qing survived for another half-century after crushing the Taiping, albeit in a weakened, almost zombified state. In any case, thank you very much for listening. It's been an interesting one, right? I mean, I think for Hung-Siu-Tshuen himself that it's kind of a complex verdict on him. Like, he was clearly a man of charisma and conviction, able to inspire all these people to follow him, and especially through that hardship he put them through. It was kind of hope to a downtrodden population, and in a language they could grasp. Religion, justice, and brotherhood, all that kind of thing. Some of the reforms that he and his followers attempted were way ahead of their time in a deeply conservative society. Think about the foot binding, the prohibition of it, the prohibition of opium use, even promoting literacy, even if it was just reading the Bible, But the flaws of Hung were equally towering. He was increasingly self-absorbed, autocratic, and just disconnected from reality as the war went on. He could be merciless, sanctioning massacres of whether they be Manchus or just people who opposed him. And in the final stage, as Xiucheng wrote quite bitterly, Hung refused pragmatic counsel and trusted blindly in miracles. He failed his people when they needed him most. And so looking back, I think the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom is a pretty remarkable phenomenon. For 14 years, a vast area of China was ruled by a renegade regime, not led by princes or traditional warlords, but by a man who melded the Bible with Chinese messianic dreams. It was perhaps an anomaly, an experiment, unlikely to have succeeded in governing long term, even if it had toppled the Qing given its internal contradictions. I'm sure even if it did topple the Qing that the Western powers would have came in and sorted it out. But then what would come after that? Who knows? In any case, you can't deny the impact it had in hastening the end of China's old order. After the Taiping and the contemporaneous rebellions were put down, there was also the Nian Rebellion in the north and the Muslim uprisings in the west, the Dungan Rebellion, and so forth. The Qing had merely postponed their fall. A kind of Pyrrhic victory. The dynasty just limped on, weakened, and the social issues that sparked the Taiping, injustice, poverty, foreigners, continued to foment unrest until the imperial system itself fell in 1911. But that's a story for another time. In any case, our time is over for today, unless you want to go watch another video, which you can do if you like. Maybe you're already asleep. If you're still awake, give me a comment, and I'll respond to you. Say something like, "Glory to the Taiping," and I'll respond to it with a voice note. In any case, I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, who I'm not sure if is a real doctor or not, maybe not, I don't know. Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, KTP, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Al Tazarkin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aidan, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun 101, Brandy, Bestie Hun, Stevie, Jessica, Scott, Gail, Emily, Jade, Jake, Demon's Toe, and Mason. Thank you so much. And yes, that's it for us for today. Hope you enjoyed. Lots of love to you all, and I will see you whenever you feel like coming back. You know where I'll be. Farewell for now, and good night.